The Democratic Party of the United States is the oldest voter-based political party in the world, tracing its heritage back to Thomas Jefferson's and James Madison's Democratic-Republican Party. During the second party system from 1832 to the mid-1850s, under Presidents Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, James K.Polk, and Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, the Democrats usually bested the opposition Whig Party by narrow margins. Both parties worked hard to build grassroots organizations and maximize the turnout of voters, which often reached 80% and 90%. Both parties used patronage extensively to finance their operations, which included emerging big city political machines as well as national networks of newspapers. The Democratic Party was a proponent for farmers across the country, urban workers, and new immigrants. It was especially attractive to Irish immigrants who increasingly controlled the party machinery in the cities. The party was much less attractive to businessmen, plantation owners, evangelical Protestants, and social reformers. The party advocated westward expansion, manifest destiny, greater equality among all white men, and opposition to the national banks. From 1860 to 1932, in the era of the Civil War to the Great Depression, the opposing Republican Party, organized in the mid-1850s from the ruins of the Whig Party and some other smaller splinter groups, was dominant in presidential politics. The Democrats elected only 2 presidents to 4 terms of office for 72 years, Grover Cleveland, and 28th President Woodrow Wilson. Over the same period, the Democrats proved more competitive with the Republicans in congressional politics, enjoying House of Representatives majorities in 15 of the 36 Congresses elected, although only in 5 of these did they form the majority in the United States Senate. The party was split between the Bourbon Democrats, representing Eastern business interests, and the agrarian elements comprising poor farmers in the South and West. The agrarian element, marching behind the slogan of "Free Silver," captured the party in 1896 and nominated the "Great Commoner," William Jennings Bryan of Nebraska in 1896, 1900, and 1908. He lost each time. Both Bryan and Wilson were leaders of the Progressive Movement 1900 to 1920. Starting with 32nd President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1932 of the Great Depression, the party dominated the fifth party system, with its liberal, progressive policies and programs with the New Deal coalition to combat the emergency bank closings and the continuing financial depression since the famous Wall Street crash of 1929, and later going into the crises leading up to the Second World War of 1939–1941 to 1945. The Democrats and the Democratic Party finally lost the White House and control of the executive branch of government only after Roosevelt's death in April 1945 near the end of the war, and after the continuing post-war administration of Roosevelt's third Vice President of the United States, Harry S. Truman, former senator from Missouri. A new Republican Party president was only elected later in the following decade of the early 1950s, with the losses by two-time nominee, the governor of Illinois, Adlai Stevenson, to the very popular war hero and commanding general in World War II, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, with two brief interruptions since the Great Depression and World War II eras. The Democrats, with unusually large majorities for over 4 decades, controlled the lower house of the United States Congress in the House of Representatives from 1930 until 1994, and the U.S. Senate for most of that same period, electing the Speaker of the House and the Representatives' Majority Leaders, committee chairs, along with the upper house of the Senate's Majority Leaders and committee chairmen. Important Democratic Progressive Liberal leaders included Presidents 33rd Harry S. Truman and 36th Lyndon B. Johnson, as well as the earlier Kennedy brothers of 35th President John F. Kennedy, Senators Robert F. Kennedy of New York, and Senator Edward M. Kennedy of Massachusetts, who carried the flag for modern American political liberalism. Since the presidential election of 1976, Democrats have won 5 out of the last 10 presidential elections, winning in the presidential elections of 1976, 1992 and 1996, and 2008 and 2012. Social scientists Theodore Kaplow et al. Argue the Democratic Party nationally moved from left-center toward the center in the 1940s and 1950s, then moved further toward the right-center in the 1970s and 1980s. Origins. The modern Democratic Party emerged in the 1830s from former factions of the Democratic-Republican Party, which had largely collapsed by 1824. It was built by Martin Van Buren, who assembled a cadre of politicians in every state behind war hero Andrew Jackson of Tennessee. Jacksonian Democracy. The spirit of Jacksonian Democracy animated the party from the early 1830s to the 1850s, shaping the second party system, with the Whig Party the main opposition. After the disappearance of the Federalists after 1815 and the era of good feelings, there was a hiatus of weakly organized personal factions until about 1828-32, when the modern Democratic Party emerged along with its rival the Whigs. The new Democratic Party became a coalition of farmers, city-dwelling laborers, and Irish Catholics. Behind the party platforms, acceptance speeches of candidates, editorials, pamphlets and stump speeches, there was a widespread consensus of political values among Democrats. As Norton explains, the Democrats represented a wide range of views but shared a fundamental commitment to the Jeffersonian concept of an agrarian society. They viewed the central government as the enemy of individual liberty. The 1824 corrupt bargain had strengthened the suspicion of Washington politics. Jacksonians feared the concentration of economic and political power. They believed that government intervention in the economy benefited special interest groups and created corporate monopolies that favored the rich. They sought to restore the independence of the individual, the artisan and the ordinary farmer by ending federal support of banks and corporations, and restricting the use of paper currency, which they distrusted. The definition of the proper role of government tended to be negative, and Jackson's political power was largely expressed in negative acts. He exercised the veto more than all previous presidents combined. Jackson and his supporters also opposed reform as a movement. Reformers eager to turn the programs into legislation called for a more active government, but Democrats tended to oppose programs like educational reform amid the establishment of a public education system. They believed, for instance, that public schools restricted individual liberty by interfering with parental responsibility and undermined freedom of religion by replacing church schools. Nor did Jackson share reformers' humanitarian concerns. He had no sympathy for American Indians, initiating the removal of the Cherokees along the Trail of Tears. The party was weakest in New England, but strong everywhere else, and won most national elections thanks to strength in New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and the American frontier. Democrats opposed elites and aristocrats. The Bank of the United States and the Whiggish modernizing programs that would build up industry at the expense of the yeoman or independent small farmer. Historian Frank Towers has specified an important ideological divide. Democrats stood for the sovereignty of the people as expressed in popular demonstrations, constitutional conventions, and majority rule as a general principle of governing, whereas Whigs advocated the rule of law, written and unchanging constitutions, and protections for minority interests against majority tyranny. From 1828 to 1848, banking and tariffs were the central domestic policy issues. Democrats strongly favored, and Whigs opposed, expansion to new farmlands, as typified by their expulsion of Eastern American Indians and acquisition of vast amounts of new land in the West after 1846. The party favored the war with Mexico and opposed anti-immigrant nativism. Both Democrats and Whigs were divided on the issue of slavery. In the 1830s, the Locofocos in New York City were radically democratic, anti-monopoly, and were proponents of hard money and free trade. The chief spokesman was William Leggett. At this time labor unions were few. Some were loosely affiliated with the party. 1840s foreign policy was a major issue in the 1840s. War threatened with Mexico over Texas, and with Britain over Oregon. Democrats strongly supported Manifest Destiny and most Whigs strongly opposed it. The 1844 election was a showdown, with the Democrat James K.Polk narrowly defeating Whig Henry Clay on the Texas issue. John McFarrager's analysis of the political polarization between the parties is that most Democrats were wholehearted supporters of expansion, whereas many Whigs were opposed. Whigs welcomed most of the changes wrought by industrialization but advocated strong government policies that would guide growth and development within the country's existing boundaries. They feared that expansion raised a contentious issue, the extension of slavery to the territories. On the other hand, many Democrats feared industrialization the Whigs welcomed. For many Democrats, the answer to the nation's social ills was to continue to follow Thomas Jefferson's vision of establishing agriculture in the new territories in order to counterbalance industrialization. 1850s. The Democratic National Committee was created in 1848 at the convention that nominated General Lewis Cass, who lost to General Zachary Taylor of the Whigs. A major cause of the defeat was that the new Free Soil Party, which opposed slavery expansion, split the Democratic Party, particularly in New York, where the electoral votes went to Taylor. Democrats in Congress passed the hugely controversial Compromise of 1850. In state after state, however, the Democrats gained small but permanent advantages over the Whig Party, which finally collapsed in 1852, fatally weakened by division on slavery and nativism. The fragmented opposition could not stop the election of Democrats Franklin Pierce in 1852 and James Buchanan in 1856. During 1858–60, Senator Stephen A. Douglas confronted President Buchanan in a furious battle for control of the party. Douglas finally won, but his nomination signaled defeat for the southern wing of the party, and it walked out of the 1860 convention and nominated its own presidential ticket. Young America. Jonathan Isle argues that the 1840s and 1850s were the heyday of a new faction of young Democrats called Young America, led by Stephen A. Douglas, James K.Polk, Franklin Pierce, and New York financier August Belmont. This faction explains, broke with the agrarian and strict constructionist orthodoxies of the past and embraced commerce, technology, regulation, reform, and internationalism. The movement attracted a circle of outstanding writers, including William Cullen Bryant, George Bancroft, Herman Melville, and Nathaniel Hawthorne. They sought independence from from European standards of high culture and wanted to demonstrate the excellence and exceptionalism of America's own literary tradition. In economic policy, young America saw the necessity of a modern infrastructure with railroads, canals, telegraphs, turnpikes, and harbors. They endorsed the market revolution and promoted capitalism. They called for congressional land grants to the states, which allowed Democrats to claim that internal improvements were locally rather than federally sponsored. Young America claimed that modernization would perpetuate the agrarian vision of Jeffersonian democracy by allowing yeoman farmers to sell their products and therefore to prosper. They tied internal improvements to free trade, while accepted moderate tariffs as a necessary source of government revenue. They supported the independent treasury not as a scheme to quash the special privilege of the Whiggish moneyed elite, but as a device to spread prosperity to all Americans. Sectional confrontations escalated during the 1850s. The Democratic Party split between North and South grew deeper. The conflict was papered over at the 1852 and 1856 conventions by selecting men who had little involvement in sectionalism, but they made matters worse. Historian Roy F. Nichols explains why Franklin Pierce was not up to the challenges a Democratic president had to face. As a national political leader, Pierce was an accident. He was honest and tenacious of his views, but, as he made up his mind with difficulty and often reversed himself before making a final decision, he gave a general impression of instability. Kind, courteous, generous, he attracted many individuals, but his attempts to satisfy all factions failed and made him many enemies. In carrying out his principles of strict construction, he was most in accord with Southerners, who generally had the letter of the law on the side. He failed utterly to realize the depth and the sincerity of Northern feeling against the South, and was bewildered at the general flouting of the law and the Constitution, as he described it, by the people of his own New England. At no time did he catch the popular imagination. His inability to cope with the difficult problems that arose early in his administration caused him to lose the respect of great numbers, especially in the North, and his few successes failed to restore public confidence. He was an inexperienced man, suddenly called to assume a tremendous responsibility, who honestly tried to do his best without adequate training or temperamental fitness. In 1854, over vehement opposition, the main Democratic leader in the Senate, Stephen Douglas of Illinois, pushed through the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It established that settlers in Kansas Territory could vote to decide to allow or not allow slavery. Thousands of men moved in from North and South with the goal of voting slavery down or up, and the violence shook the nation. A major realignment took place among voters and politicians, with new issues, new parties, and new leaders. The Whig Party dissolved entirely. North and South pulled apart. The crisis for the Democratic Party came in the late 1850s, as Northern Democrats increasingly rejected national policies demanded by the Southern Democrats. The demands were to support slavery outside the South. Southerners insisted that full equality for the region required the government to acknowledge the legitimacy of slavery outside the South. The Southern demands included a fugitive slave law to recapture runaway slaves, opening Kansas to slavery, forcing a pro-slavery constitution on Kansas, acquire Cuba, accepting the Dred Scott decision of the Supreme Court, and adopting a federal slave code to protect slavery in the territories. President Buchanan, a doughface, went along with these demands. Douglas refused. Douglas proved a much better politician than Buchanan, but the bitter battle lasted for years and permanently alienated the Northern and Southern wings. When the new Republican Party formed in 1854 on the basis of refusing to tolerate the expansion of slavery into the territories, many Northern Democrats joined it. The Republicans in 1854 now had a majority in most, but not all, of the northern states. It had practically no support south of the Mason-Dixon line. The formation of the new short-lived Know-Nothing Party allowed the Democrats to win the presidential election of 1856. Buchanan, a northern doughface, split the party on the issue of slavery in Kansas when he attempted to pass a federal slave code as demanded by the South. Most Democrats in the North rallied to Senator Douglas, who preached popular sovereignty and believed that a federal slave code would be undemocratic. The Democratic Party was unable to compete with the Republican Party, which controlled nearly all northern states by 1860, bringing a solid majority in the Electoral College. The Republicans claimed that the Northern Democrats, including doughfaces such as Pierce and Buchanan, and advocates of popular sovereignty such as Stephen A. Douglas and Lewis Cass, were all accomplices to slave power. The Republicans argued that slaveholders, all of them Democrats, had seized control of the federal government and were blocking the progress of liberty. In 1860, the Democrats were unable to stop the election of Republican Abraham Lincoln, even as they feared his election would lead to civil war. The Democrats split over the choice of a successor to President Buchanan along northern and southern lines. Factions of the party provided two separate candidacies for president in the election of 1860, in which the Republican Party gained ascendancy. Some Southern Democratic delegates followed the lead of the Fire Eaters by walking out of the Democratic Convention at Charleston's Institute Hall in April 1860 and were later joined by those who, once again led by the Fire Eaters, left the Baltimore Convention the following June when the convention rejected a resolution supporting extending slavery into territories whose voters did not want it. The Southern Democrats nominated the pro-slavery incumbent Vice President John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky for president and General Joseph Lane, former governor of Oregon, for vice president. The Northern Democrats proceeded to nominate Douglas of Illinois for president and former governor of Georgia Herschel Vespasian Johnson for vice president, while some Southern Democrats joined the Constitutional Union Party, backing its nominees. Former Senator John Bell of Tennessee for president and the politician Edward Everett of Massachusetts for vice president. This fracturing of the Democrats left them powerless. Republican Abraham Lincoln was elected the 16th President of the United States. Douglas campaigned across the country calling for unity and came in second in the popular vote, but carried only Missouri and New Jersey. Breckinridge carried 11 slave states, coming in second in the electoral vote, but third in the popular vote.